Hello, this is Brandon Smith, a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. I'm giving this presentation on Space Shuttle Columbia's final mission for POL 510 Public Management, taught by Professor Goodman. We're going to start this presentation by giving a very brief summary of the accident, what occurred, when it occurred, and just the mechanical failure that led to the shuttle being destroyed. After that, we will go into the lessons that can be learned from the accident, the first of which being the importance of clear roles and powers. By this, I mean the importance that should be placed on an organization, whether it's a large organization or whether it's a smaller group nested inside of a large organization, as is the case in this situation. The importance that those groups have clear roles and clear powers, and that they know what they are and that everyone else knows what they are. The second lesson that we're going to go into is that of goal clarity. And by goal clarity, in this case, I mean the importance that any organization, public or otherwise, have clear and defined goals that everyone understands and agrees upon. And finally, the last lesson that we'll go into is what I've identified as self-awareness and self-assessment. This one is a little bit more abstract of an idea, but it's mostly based on the training capacity that we learned about previously in the course. The idea that when you keep doing something enough times and it seems to have worked every time up until then, it can eventually cause a situation where you're unable to adapt to a changed circumstance. So starting in on the summary, on January 16th, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia was launched. During launch, something occurred called a foam strike, which was by no means a new occurrence, but in this case, it wound up being particularly deadly. What happened was a piece of foam that was located at the bipod ramp attach point on the shuttle became loose and dislodged during takeoff and flew backwards, colliding with the leading edge of the left wing of the shuttle itself. The foam strike was identified shortly after launch, only the very next day. They noticed that it had occurred, and they started an investigation into it with the intercenter photo working group. But unfortunately, after a few days of investigation, they wound up writing it off as a maintenance issue, not a safety issue, and they continued along with the flight. Unfortunately, then on February 1st, when the shuttle was re-entering the atmosphere, the damage that had been caused to the left wing allowed superheated air to get in there, melt the inside of the wing, causing the entire structure to eventually be ripped apart on re-entry, killing the entire crew and destroying the shuttle, scattering its debris over eastern Texas and parts of Louisiana. So jumping right into lesson number 1, the idea that we need to make sure that any organization has clear roles and powers. We found out during the multimedia case study that there were multiple groups doing the same sort of work investigating the foam strike. The first of these groups was the Intercenter Photo Working Group. They are the ones who initially presented the foam strike to the mission management team led by Linda Ham. And Bob Page made the first imagery request shortly after the Intercenter Photo Group started working, and they realized they didn't have photos with sufficient resolution. They requested more enhanced imagery from the Department of Defense of the wing so they could better assess the damage that was caused. The mission management team had this presented to them, and they sort of hand-waved it for the time being and said, well, we'll get back to it once we have better photos, and they just moved right on. Shortly after that, the debris assessment team was assembled. This was a group of engineers mostly. It was a more formal group that was going to, in detail, look at the debris, the foam strike occurrence, and kind of assess whether or not it was a credible threat to the safety of the mission. What we found out pretty quickly was that this group had very unclear power. And there was an interview with Dr. Sheila Widnall, who wound up being on the Columbia Accident Investigation Board later on. She had mentioned that during their investigation of this situation, the debris assessment team's goals and their powers were not clear. They didn't even have a clear charter. It was unclear who they reported to. It was unclear who they were headed by. And it really just seemed like a very loosely held together group for a job as important as making sure that the space shuttle wasn't going to be destroyed. It was really a shockingly weak group. They were supposed to apparently go through the mission management team and Linda Ham to request detailed imagery, which they did not do. They instead issued a formal request through the incorrect channels. They just went straight to the I think Johnson Air Force Base to try and get more detailed imagery. And then they also issued a second informal request. Meanwhile, Linda Ham was talking to someone else that was on the debris assessment team who worked nearby, and he was telling her that it was just a maintenance issue, not a safety of flight issue. This guy was a thermal protections expert, Calvin Schomburg, I believe was his name. He wound up convincing her informally that it wasn't going to be an issue. And what wound up happening was then later on, Linda Ham was called. They were asking her if she had requested the imagery, and she told them to dismiss the request for imagery. And unfortunately, this was in response to Bob Page back from the Intercenter Photo Working Group. And the debris assessment team had thought that this was a denial of their request for imagery because they didn't realize that they needed to go through Linda Ham in order to get the request made. This is just it was a very arcane and very rules-oriented bureaucratic setup, and they weren't informed of the formality of it and what they needed to make sure, or who they needed to talk to get something done. And what this wound up causing was a complete breakdown of communication. And I think that that's the first thing that we can learn from this whole situation, is that the breakdown and the importance of formal communication versus informal communication. Linda Ham had gotten a lot of the information that she acted on informally from Calvin Schomburg, who he was on the debris assessment team, but he wasn't a chair of it. He wasn't even the co-chair of it. I believe Bob White was the chair of it. And she treated this information and his opinion as an actionable thing, using it as rationale to cancel the image request, not knowing that the debris assessment team was formally requesting additional imagery, just not through her. And she probably expected it to come through her if it was going to be a real request. So ultimately, this all caused the mission management team to treat it as a maintenance issue instead of a safety one. And this goes to show that in this situation, as well as any organization really, the most important thing that you can make sure happens is good communication. It's absolutely vital to the success of any organization, public or otherwise. The other thing that I think we can learn from this is the importance of having a clear purpose. It's important in any organization that the responsibilities and goals of the organization are clear, that they have a clear place in the bureaucratic hierarchy. It's pretty clear that one of the issues that arise here was the interplay between the Intercenter Photo Working Group, the debris assessment team, and the mission management team. They didn't have a clear relationship to one another. It seems like Linda Ham and the mission management team were waiting for the debris assessment team to tell them that something was wrong, but they didn't do it formally. So the entire thing broke down. Basically, the debris assessment team thought that they had the authority to go directly to retrieve the photos and didn't realize they needed to go through Linda Ham. So the group that wound up receiving the request said that they didn't know who the request had come from, and Linda Ham said, well, we haven't requested it. So the group just dismissed the request entirely. The photos were never received by the debris assessment team, and the entire situation devolved from there. And the debris assessment team, the CAIB said that they tried to go after the photos in other ways, but it's clear they never really received the attention that they deserved. And aside from the larger organizational issues that were at play, this is probably the most direct cause of the lack of action from NASA regarding the foam strike. And what we can learn from this is the importance that the powers and relationship to other organizations in the hierarchy is very important for an organization to know and to understand. If the debris assessment team had been aware that their position was below the mission management team and that they had to go through the mission management team to get anything done, then they very may well have done that, and the mission management team would have likely requested the photos that they needed, and a possible rescue mission or repair mission, but probably a rescue mission could have been mounted, and maybe the lives of the crew could have at least been saved. So moving on to the second lesson that I think can be learned from the Columbia disaster is what I refer to as goal clarity. And to be clear, that when I talk about goal clarity, what I'm referring to is the idea that everyone's on the same page as to what the goals are and what order they're in an administration or in an organization. In the case of NASA, they had what they referred to as the Node 2 deadline for February 19th, 2004, which was the following year, where they had pledged through Administrator Sean O'Keefe that the United States would have all of its components of the International Space Station shuttled up and placed in location on the International Space Station. And what they found and what was shown through the multimedia case study was that this exerted a lot of pressure on people at NASA. In Admiral Gemmen's testimony to Congress about the Columbia Accident Investigation Board's findings, he mentioned that when they had interviewed people at NASA, 100% of the upper management of NASA said that this was not exerting a lot of pressure on them and that they didn't feel very much pressure from the timeline. Meanwhile, when they interviewed what he called the worker bees at NASA, they felt enormous pressure for this timeline. And this mismatch of priorities caused a situation where there was a complete miscommunication as to what the truth was, and probably led to more of a lax emphasis on security or on safety specifically. As was mentioned in the multimedia case study, this got so bad that the pressure was so great that the NASA headquarters had sent out a screensaver for everyone that had a down to the second countdown of when the Node 2 deadline was. And while the upper management may have said that this didn't create much timeline pressure on them, I really have a hard time believing that. For instance, this may have caused the situation where Linda Ham was going to be the mission management chair on the next mission as well. And it's certainly implied through the case study that her sights were set on the next mission, and just trying to get this one up and in the air and back down as fast as possible. And that she, had she not been focused on making sure that she upheld her part of the timeline, which was already extremely tight, that she may have been able to, notice the situation that was occurring with the communication breakdowns that I mentioned previously. So with regards to goal clarity, I think there are really two aspects to what we can learn here. The first lesson is that the goals of an organization and the prioritization of those goals needs to be understood very clearly by everyone who is involved in the organization. The idea that the management claims that they weren't feeling a lot of pressure or that the timeline wasn't the most important thing, meanwhile the people lower down on the ladder seemed to believe that the timeline was of the utmost importance, it's pretty clear this miscommunication is a recipe for disaster. The second aspect with regards to goal setting and goal clarity that I think that we can learn here is the importance of not sacrificing short-term goals for long-term goals, and being aware they can conflict with each other. In the Rainey text, one of my most cited quotes so far in the course has been when he says, "The goals in a set often conflict with one another. Maximizing one goal takes away from another goal. Short-term and long-term goals can conflict with each other." I think that quote is particularly relevant in this situation where, as I said, the long-term goal of Node 2 and the deadline may have pushed the short-term goal of a safe flight into the background. And I feel like that could have very, very well made the difference between a safe flight and a disaster like we wound up experiencing. The third and final lesson that I think can be taken away from the Columbia accident is that what I refer to as self-awareness and self-assessment. And by self in this case, I don't necessarily mean the individual self, but I mean more of the idea that the public manager needs to be aware of the methods and strategies that their organization uses to achieve their goals, and needs to constantly be reassessing those and making sure that they are updated whenever necessary. For instance, specifically in this case, the way that the foam strike was handled, and the way that it was so readily dismissed by everyone, seems like a pretty prime example of what we learned about in the Merton article called Trained Incapacity. In that article, he defines trained incapacity as the state of affairs in which one's abilities function as inadequacies or blind spots. Actions based upon training and skills, which have been successfully applied in the past, may result in inappropriate responses under changed conditions. I think that this is exactly what happened here with the foam strikes. And it's something that any bureaucracy that deals with somewhat repetitive situations needs to be incredibly aware of, and I think their methods need to be under constant reassessment because of that. The shuttle program had undergone many flights, and I think nearly a dozen out of about 113 of them, so about 10% of them, had experienced some sort of foam strike. And after a few of these, it stopped being treated as a safety issue, started being treated as a maintenance issue, and it was very clear through the case study and through the Accident Investigation Board's findings that it was assumed in this case that it was just like the other ones, where this was just going to be another maintenance issue. It was more of a problem later on when they were going to send Columbia back up. It wasn't going to be a problem when Columbia was trying to come back down. And I think that very clearly led to the sort of hand-waving that occurred, where Linda Hammond, the mission management team, was very receptive to an informal explanation of the event and the idea that it was just going to be a maintenance issue, and they wound up trying to save face instead, not requesting the images that they should have been requesting, not facilitating the success of the debris assessment team. And I believe that is this is the deepest cultural issue that occurred that allowed the foam strike to take place in the first place, and also that dictated the very lackluster response from NASA to the foam strike. So the lesson, like I said, is to constantly reassess and constantly self-examine and try and just be very aware of how no two situations are the same, and that it's very likely that in a bureaucratic structure or in a public organization that this trained incapacity can take hold and will eventually lead to mistreatment of situations, usually not as dire as the circumstance here, but mistreatment all the same. So in conclusion, I believe that there are three major lessons that can be taken away for public managers from the Columbia accident. The first of those lessons is to clarify roles and powers of your organization and any smaller organizations that exist within it. The key parts of that are making sure that communication remains open between all workers on all levels. And the second aspect of that is ensuring that the location within the hierarchy and the powers of each sub-organization are understood by everyone in the larger group. The second lesson is that of goal clarity, goal communication, ensuring that all workers are on the same page with regards to the goals and their priorities, and short-term versus long-term awareness, being aware that sometimes if you focus too much on long-term goals, short-term goals can get neglected or forgotten or sacrificed. And the final lesson is self-awareness and self-assessment. The public manager specifically needs to always be reassessing the methods that are being used within the organization, and also needs to be aware of the threat of trained incapacity, making sure that whenever a new situation crops up, that situation is being treated as an individual situation with its own aspects and features to it, and that the old, tired methods of dealing with situations like it are not just applied carte blanche, and make sure that new situations are not assumed to be the same as similar situations from the past. And that's going to wrap up my presentation. Unfortunately, I went quite a bit over the time limit. I didn't expect that I would be able to talk about this for any more than 15 minutes, but turns out I had a lot to say. So I hope that this has provided a good wrap-up and a good explanation of the Columbia accident and the applications for public managers. With this submission, I've included a link to the slide deck if there are any questions or if you need to reference something, and please do not hesitate to ask me if you have any questions. Thanks.